Today's topic is population and urbanization. Do you guys know how important this topic is? Population in particular? Well, it's more for the world, not necessarily for Korea, because of the expanding population. The biggest threat to humanity is happening because of our meat-based diet. So I will say a few words about that. I've already said it a few times, right? But I'll be making a point again about that. Okay. Okay. So the lecture outline goes like this. I'll first start with comments about the world population. How it started small, but it's now maybe beyond the carrying capacity of the earth. I'll leave that judgment to you. And there are views of population growth. So there are different views on how population growth has been taking shape, and whether the population growth should continue or should stop. Okay. And then I briefly talk about the characteristics of population in Korea. And then I move on to the next big topic, which is urbanization. And under urbanization, I talk about the types of urban settlements, like city. And I don't know if you're familiar with megalopolis. Well, if you're not, you'll get to hear what that is. And then there are views on urbanization, what urbanization or urban life is like, or how urban life is different from rural life. Okay, and then I talk about the urbanization processes in Korea, and then talk about the characteristics and problems associated with urbanization in Korea. Okay. So, and lastly, I compare how urbanization in Korea is different from that of the West. Okay? So just looking at the lecture outline, you'll see we have quite a lot to cover, right? And then from 4 o'clock, we'll have group presentations. Okay? All right. So, I'm sure it's not something that you think about when it comes to sort of what things impact the life that you have. But population is one of those important sources of social change, especially its impact on economy, environment, and also urbanization is quite noteworthy. Okay. One of the most important changes regarding population has been the rapid growth of the world population. So this much I'm sure you know, right? But I think I mentioned this before. At the dawn of agriculture, which happened around, let's say, 8000 BC, what do you think was the world population? So this is like 10,000 years ago. For your information, the world population today is 7.7 billion. And 10,000 years ago, the world population was? Just take a guess. Just pick any number. Just any number. In the millions, of course. 20 million. Very good. Yes. Hey, that's good too. Was 5 million. Okay, it's just this rough estimate. But just again, 10,000 years ago, the world population was only 5 million. And that number today is 7.7 billion. And if you were to sort of look up things to sort of enrich your knowledge about what happened in the world. I think I mentioned the Enlightenment, right? Scientific revolution, and of course Industrial Revolution, because so many things happen after this. Okay, that sort of set the stage for the intensification of capitalism and industrialization itself, technological advancement, medical advances, all of these things that we sort of come to take for granted sort of began with Industrial Revolution, before this Scientific Revolution / Enlightenment. Okay, so the time period, or the year in which the world population reached 1 billion mark, was 1804. So it means it took humanity all of the history of the earth to reach. So if you want to trace the history of the earth to maybe billions of years, then it took humanity that long a time to reach its first 1 billion. Okay? But since what happened? It took us only 130 years to add second billion to the world population. Okay? And then third billion was reached in 30 years, fourth billion, 15 years, fifth billion, 13 years, 6 billion, 12 years, and seventh billion, 14 years, and eighth billion will be reached in about 5 years, and that will mean that it took only 11 years to add another billion to the world population. Okay? So you can see how, just to get a sense of how rapidly world population has been growing, I think this is a good sort of data to sort of see, right? So this is sort of a graphic sort of data which show you again 8000 BC, only 5 million, but you can see how population has been just growing so rapidly since about 1800s. Okay? And the top 10 countries in the world population is China today, but by the end of this century, it'll be India, which will have the largest population by far. Okay? You can see that the Chinese population will decline quite noticeably by the end of this century. Okay? Because of China is one of the countries that is suffering from low fertility rate too. Okay? So views of population growth. Okay? So what do scholars think or say about population growth? The first theory that gained wide currency, this idea was put out, more than 200 years ago. Isn't this amazing? It's called Malthusian theory, and it's an idea by Thomas Malthus, and he said that the population increases geometrically. Okay, so if you're not a sort of a mathematically oriented person, geometric calculation means that it doubles. Okay, so 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, okay, and so on. While food production increases only arithmetically. Okay, arithmetically means addition of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So you see the difference, right? So, and this means that with the population growth, that is unchecked population growth, and there will be shortage of food, leading to mass starvation. Okay? So this idea was widely accepted by many people, many scholars, many economists, many policymakers. Okay? Now, looking back at this idea now, has this happened? Yes or no? So if you shake your head, this didn't happen. But we did have episodes of mass starvation, right? In some parts of the world, like in Africa. What happened there then? So when he said shortage of food, he didn't mean, to like, he didn't specify, like America or Asia or Africa. He just said overall, right? But if we did have episodes of mass starvation in certain parts of the world, it was not because the world was suffering from food shortage. It was a problem of distribution, meaning we have enough food if we shared. But of course, food is also a commodity now, things bought and sold, right? So this idea has been proven sort of wrong, okay? Because yes, one thing that was correct was that yes, population growth has been very, very rapid, okay? Anyway, the second theory is called zero population growth, or should I say a call for zero population growth. And what does it mean by this? So there is a neo-Malthusian view which calls for a goal of zero population growth. Okay? Now here's the idea. Okay? Now see, again, the Malthusian theory argues that if population growth is left unchecked, there will be food shortage leading to mass starvation, crisis, right? But the neo-Malthusian theory, which is equated with a call for zero population growth, argues that big population growth is still a problem, but not because of potential food shortage, but because how that will impact the environment. Okay? Large number of people means that the environment will be that much more damaged. Okay? Especially because of our meat-based diet. Okay? Increasingly, all over the world, more people are eating meat than ever before. And as countries become more modernized and economically more developed, chances are they'll be eating more meat. Okay? I think a good example is Korea. Okay? Back, 30, 20 years ago, I think the frequency of eating meat for Korea, typical Korean, was maybe once a week, twice a week. No, not twice a week, but once a month maybe, okay? But now, it's something that one can do on a daily basis without too much cost, okay? Anyway, so I'm going to be telling you some facts that are disturbing about our meat-based diet, okay? Right now, in the whole world, there are about 70 billion farm animals, okay? When I say farm animals, I mean they are being raised for food. I'm talking about cows, pigs, goats, chickens, okay? So the largest number in the 70 billion would be chickens, okay? But out of all the world's crop, only 55% are actually eaten directly by people. 36% is used for animal feed, meaning more than a third of crops that we humans produce is not for our consumption, but for these farm animals. Okay? And 1/3 of all agricultural land, we're not including desert here, okay? 1/3 of all land that is used for agriculture is solely used for livestock feed production. So why do we, have all these production for, why are we producing all these crops for livestock? Because there is that much demand for meat, okay? And in your lifetime, you know how many animals you eat? Okay, again, that includes chickens, okay? 7,000. So I'm not gonna say, because I myself not a vegetarian, nor vegan, but although I'm trying, but the least you can do for the earth is to minimize your meat intake. That's, if there's any message from me on a personal note, eat less meat, that's all I'm saying, okay? And try to do what is called OMD. 1 meal a day, which is 100% vegetarian, okay? When I say vegetarian, it doesn't mean, you should not eat rice or bread, just no meat, okay? It's not, I don't think this will be that difficult, no? Anyway, global meat production is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than all of the trains, cars, airplanes in the world combined. So, what we eat is having a more devastating impact on the environment than all these cars, trains, and airplanes in the world combined, okay? And there are these top meat-eating countries. Australia. This is the latest figure I could only find, but from 2013, per capita consumption of meat in Australia was over 93 kilograms. So if you're trying to figure out how heavy that is, just think about your weight. See, I weigh 73 kilograms. So a typical Australian ate meat amounting to something heavier than moi, right? And where is China is at the bottom here, but South Korea is also a top meat eating country, okay? And have you heard of water footprint? Okay, so you can see here, eating beef is the most damaging thing to do as far as water waste or water sort of expenditure is concerned, okay? And it's not included here, but you know what is more damaging? Chocolate. To produce 1 kilogram of chocolate, it has to use up over 20,000 liters of water. So if you're a big patron or fan of chocolate, think again. Every time you eat a bite of that wonderful, sugary, tasty chocolate, you're taking more footsteps in destroying the environment than maybe eating or drinking a cup of tea. Okay. Sorry for putting you in a. So if you're a major chocolate eater, probably didn't feel so good hearing that, right? So the hamburger. Oof. Okay, there we go. Chocolate, you see there? So, what more can I say? Again, 1 kilogram. To produce 1 kilogram of chocolate, it uses more water, much more water than producing 1 kilogram of beef. Okay? And it's missing here, but another one that was really high in water consumption was I forget. But type this, okay, water footprint, and see what result you get, so that you become more mindful of, things you do or things you eat. Okay. By eating less meat, we can fight climate change, reduce water use. Excuse me. And the world population of 7.7 billion people represents just 0.01% of all living things. How they come up with that figure, I don't know, but since the dawn of civilization, humanity has caused the loss of 83% of all wild animals and half of plants. So if I have this, of course it's incomplete, but I want you to just think more about the environment, okay? So yes, we are here to learn about Korea, but I think our knowledge should always be more than what is sort of what's at hand, okay? So anyway, this is sort of another sort of thing that is not really about Korea, but I wanted to sort of put this in so that I have a more complete picture as to how we need to be more mindful of the environment. Okay, and again, it is closely tied to a huge population growth of the world, right? Did you know that the things you maybe dislike, insects, their population has been declining noticeably all over the world, okay? And it has to do with what humans are doing to the environment or to the nature, okay? Because of increasing population, what are we doing? We clear the land. So there's a huge loss of habitat for these insects, okay? And there's a global warming that is also not good for these insects. And what else? The pesticides, herbicides, fertilizer we use, they kill these insects, okay? And why is that bad? Why is that a problem? So if you didn't have this sense of appreciation for insects, it's time to think again. Why are they important to our survival? Yes. For foods. These insects are responsible for about 75% of all pollinations that take place. Pollinations that allow us to eat vegetables, fruits. Can we survive without eating vegetables, eating fruits? Impossible, right? And these are the insects that we take for granted, including bees, of course. Okay? They're dying. And we just gotta stop somewhere, stop expanding these, places we live. In the name of, building houses, we keep on destroying nature, right? And which is really killing all these insects, which are at the bottom of the ecosystem. You're familiar with ecosystem, right? So there's a food chain, and at the bottom of the food chain on land is typically insects. And if there are not enough of those insects, what will happen? Birds will die. And with not enough bees and all that, it really portends a lot of terrible things for our survival. Okay? So, there you go. So, our food production will just be so terribly affected. Okay? loss of habitat, intensive agriculture, climate change. Okay? So the third, took a little while for me to cover the last one, but I'm talking about the views on population growth. The first one was Malthusian theory. The second one was neo-Malthusian theory, which calls for zero population growth. Third is demographic transition theory, okay? Something that you're probably familiar with. Demographic transition theory suggests that future population growth will develop along a predictable 4-stage model, okay? And it looks like this, okay? So the first stage is pre-industrial stage, where birth rate and death rate are high, okay? And that's what happened, right, in pre-industrial period. In the transitional stage, death rate declines due to increased food production and improved medical care. Okay, so death rate falls, but birth rate remains high, which leads to high population growth. Okay, but in the industrial stage, birth rate declines due to increased opportunities for women, and women having access to birth control. Okay, so again, in industrial stage, birth rate falls because women have access to birth control methods, and also because women want to enjoy opportunities in economic and social sphere. Okay, so because both birth rate and death rate are low, the population sort of stabilizes. There is no longer high population growth. Now in the fourth stage, post-industrial stage, that trend sort of stays the same, but some may also experience negative population growth. Okay, like what's happening in Japan, and what is going to happen to Korea. Okay, but the idea here is that population growth is seen as a temporary phenomenon. Okay, so this is the opposite of the Malthusian theory, right? Malthusian theory argues that population growth will not be stopped unless we do something, but here it happens naturally. Okay? And the next is population in Korea. Facts about the population in Korea go like this. The current population is some 51 million people, and that is 28th largest in the world. And population density is 507 per square kilometers, and that's 23rd highest in the world. Okay? And this gives you a good picture of what the population of Korea is like, including South and North Korea. The green is the population of both Koreas. The orange line, South Korea. The blue line, North Korea, right? And I think I showed you this before, but you can see how the sort of brown line, or the orange, is the high projection of the future population trends. The purple line is the medium projection, and the blue line is low projection. So as you can see, if the low projection is correct, by the end of this century, Korea's population could fall below 20 million. Okay? Again, right now the current population is 51 million, and it'll be more than halved by the end of this century. Okay? At the rate of the current record low fertility rate. This is not a sort of fanciful or the outrageous projection. It's a distinct possibility. Okay. Now we turn to the next big sort of topic is urbanization. Now, before I turn to this urbanization, do you have any comments or questions about population? About Korea or about the world population? Any ideas, any comments, any questions about this topic of population? No? Okay. Moving on to urbanization. So, along with population, an important aspect of social change has been urbanization, okay? Or the rise and growth of cities. So urbanization is the process by which an increasing population lives in cities, or increasing proportion of a population lives in cities. And like population growth, urbanization has had important consequences for many aspects of social, political, and economic life. So I think, population growth and urbanization sort of go hand in hand in the sense that before the recent sort of a modern period, it wasn't really a problem or phenomenon, okay? Like I said earlier, first billion in human population was reached only about 200 years ago, and urbanization also started to really happen in earnest from about 200 years ago. Okay, so that's why these are relatively recent phenomena. Okay, that's why they sort of go hand in hand, and so the major impetus or the major driving force of urbanization was also Industrial Revolution, and because with factories and with other sites of industrial production sort of propping up, people began to be attracted to those areas. Hence, the beginning of sort of rapid urbanization. Okay? And over time, technological innovations made it possible for cities to expand. And with this sort of heading, what technological innovations are we talking about here? For cities to become larger, what do you think happened technologically? I'm not talking about at the time of Industrial Revolution, like 1760. But over time, technological advances went hand in hand with increasing urbanization. Is this too difficult a question? Doesn't matter. If you're thinking, you're not thinking. So are you thinking? What technological advances must have happened like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that allowed urbanization to really happen? Yes? Yes. And what do we mean by transportation? Are we talking about jet airplanes or something lesser?
Not just airplanes.
No, that doesn't really have to do with urbanization, but so you're right in saying transportation technology, but at the time, more close to time of Industrial Revolution was what? Trains, railroads, and automobiles, right? And regarding buildings, you're also talking about cast iron. In building big buildings, you need this very strong thing called cast iron, and of course the elevator. Okay. Are we missing any other major technological innovations which helped urbanization? Well, something to think about in your free time. Today, urbanization means not only that more people live in cities, but also that today's cities are much larger. That much you would agree. According to the UN, and this is a key sort of a year, 2008. Keep that in mind. For the first time in history, isn't this something? You have lived through a time or something that happened for the first time in human history. In 2008, think about where you were. For the first time in human history, more than half of the world's population were living in urban areas. Again, we're talking about urbanization, so you can see that it's been happening only for a very short period of time. If you think of the history in terms of 30,000, 50,000, 60,000 years, again, this is a very sort of interesting sort of thing to point out, right? Yes?
How did the UN define these urban areas?
That's a very good question. I'll get to that when we talk about urban settlements. Okay? Good question. You know, how you define, what settlements are classified as urban areas, right? So, depending on how you do that, you get different figures, right? Anyway, the figure is expected to rise to 60% by 2030. So there you go. 2008, and that is when the people living in urban areas surpassed the number of people living in rural areas. And if you look at the world population, in terms of like the percentage of people living in urban areas and rural areas, as you can see, in 1950, far more number of people lived in rural areas. By 2000, it was getting almost even. But in 2030, more people will be living in urban areas than in rural areas. And if you compare developed countries from less developed countries, which countries do you think have a higher rate of urbanization? Very good. Developed. Okay? You can see that developed nations have a much higher rate of urbanization. Okay? Okay, so here we go. Types of urban settlements. City. Typical working definitions for small city population start at around 100,000 people. Okay? But countries differ in awarding a city status. Okay? So USA, for example, could grant a city status or even a town. Because just because you live in a town does not mean that you're living in a rural area. Okay? Because anywhere between, for example, in the USA, 1,500 to 5,000, good enough to be classified as a town or city, but it counts as an urban area, not rural. Okay? So, so as far as how the UN, like what it did with in terms of definition, I guess this is my guess. I think it collected data from all these countries, right? Because Korea has its own data where it says in Korea, let's say 90% of the people live in urban areas, then UN would say that that's Korea's rate, right? So, but what is sort of better to know is that countries differ, okay, in what designates a settlement as an urban area or not. Okay? Suburbs are the community surrounding cities, and I'm sure many of you have not heard of exurbs. This is definitely more of a North American phenomenon. Do you also have that in Europe? Yes. Okay, so you know why this is not true for Korea? I mean, we also have many satellite cities, somewhat far away from the center of Seoul, and yet, as you move farther away from the center of the city, the land prices, housing prices get cheaper. But in North America, that's not the case. Some of the most expensive ones are exurbs, right? So I guess, whether you have exurbs or not depends on the housing prices of, let's say, and if you watch enough Hollywood movies, you know what I'm talking about, right? For example, from New York. If you're really wealthy, you'll be taking a train ride for like an hour away from New York, center of New York, and you would have a really nice big house, right? But if you had that in Korea, that house the housing price would be much lower than what you find in the center of Seoul. Okay. Next is metropolis. It's the area comprising central city and surrounding smaller cities. So I hope that from now on, when you see a population of any city, always ask yourself, does that mean just the city itself or metropolitan population? So if you hear population of 14 million for LA, do you think that refers only to the city population or metro LA? That is metro. Okay? I think the population of LA itself is what? 2 million or 4 million. Okay? So, thank you. And there's a thing called also mega city, a very large metropolitan area with 10 million or more residents. And as of 2017, there were 47 mega cities in the world. And as of 2016, the world's largest metropolitan cities are number 1, Tokyo, number 2, Shanghai, and Seoul is number 5. Okay? And other notable metropolitan areas, New York, well, LA, 18.8. And have you heard of this term, megalopolis? Okay? So it's not that difficult to really define it. It's a long chain of continuous or continual metropolitan areas. Okay? So, think about your own country. Okay? Can you think of a megalopolis in your country? Okay, let's start with an American student. Who is from the United States? Can you think of a megalopolis? Chain of metropolitan areas in one area.
In California, we have like the Bay Area and Southern California, which is just like a bunch.
Yes. So you could say San Diego, LA, Santa Barbara, and so on, right? And in northern California, you have San Francisco, Oakland, yes, San Jose, and so on, right? And in eastern coast, you also have Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and so on, right? So there you go. Now, what about in Korea? Are there megalopolises in Korea? Korean students. Chain of metropolitan areas. You see, you can see how this term was developed, not for Korea necessarily, because we live in a very small land. So if you think of one megalopolis, it covers half of South Korea. Okay? 인천, 서울, 수원, 대전, 대구, 부산. And the other half, 인천, 서울, 대전, 전주, 광주. Okay? All of country, all of South Korea explained in 2 megalopolis. Okay? And what about in China? Well, it's not me who came up with this idea, but it's definitely identified by Chinese scholars. There are 13 megalopolises in China, and the one is Pearl River Delta megalopolis, including all these metropolitan areas. Population of this one megalopolis is bigger than South Korea. Okay? And this, just for your information, something to think about. Which are more prosperous? Small to mid-sized cities or large cities? I'm sure you didn't think about the question before, but something to think about. And I have data to prove one to be, much better in terms of economic activities. Take a pick. Which are more prosperous, small to mid-sized cities or large cities? And maybe this will help you determine where you want to live. If sort of material comfort and wealth is what you're aiming for in life. So here we go. A study shows that large cities throughout the world, this is not specific to North America, Asia, China, Korea, Europe, but this is for the whole world. Larger cities throughout the world are more prosperous. Okay? And here are the data. People in large metro areas are wealthier across all regions. Okay? That is, and the difference is the most significant in China. Okay? Where per capita GDP for people living in largest cities in China, their per capita GDP was almost 5 times higher than their counterparts living in small to mid-sized cities. Okay? But you can also see that in North America, per capita GDP was higher at the margin of 46.6% for people living in largest cities. And also in Western Europe, it was similar, right? So people living in the per capita GDP of Western Europeans living in some of the largest metro areas, their per capita GDP was 40.7 times higher. No, 40.7% higher than people living in small to mid-sized cities. Okay? And the same idea goes like this. Large metro areas generated nearly half of the world's production, and you can see there, right? And large metro areas expanded at a faster pace than the global economy. Okay? So the blue shaded bars, 300 largest metro areas, and the gray shaded bars, the rest of the world. Right? And in the first half, we talked about population, right? World population growth, the views on population growth, and also talked about very briefly the sort of the facts about the Korean population, right? And then we just started talking about urbanization, how that was also something that sort of began relatively recently, and if I could remember one thing, as of 2008, for the first time in human history, more people live in urban areas than rural areas. And a student asked a very good question, you know, how do you sort of define, how you sort of categorize someone as living in urban area and someone as living in rural area? And the best answer I could give was that, the countries have different criteria in sort of determining what urban settlement is an urban area and what is not. The UN probably had to depend on the data of all these different countries and sort of came up with an average, right? Now, I start the second half with the views on urban life. So, again, more than half of the world people living in the world live in urban areas, and by 2030, the proportion of people living in urban areas will reach 60%. So, urbanism, or way of life that is defined by urban life, is something that affects majority of the world population. So wouldn't it be sort of interesting to learn how life is different? So you can sort of make comparisons between life in rural area and life in urban area. Okay, so this is what views on urban life is. Okay, so the first view is by a German sociologist, and I hope my pronunciation is okay, Ferdinand Tönnies. And we have a German student, and he came up with the concept of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Okay? And Gemeinschaft, roughly meaning community in German. So Tönnies argued that urbanization marks a shift from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. And I'll just lay it out for you like this. Is Gesellschaft closer to association or society? More society. Okay, thank you. So you can see that, right? So so this is something that because you guys, most of you, I'm sure, have all your life, right? You lived in city, urban area. So maybe it's a good time to sort of think about, what your parents, what kinds of life or what kinds of cultural, societal settings that your parents might have been exposed to, and how things have changed over time. So again, you gotta think of this in context. For most of the human history, people lived in Gemeinschaft. Okay? So only in recent years, and when I say recent years, we're talking about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the urbanization has become a sort of fact of life. But even in Korea, just a half a century ago, more people lived in rural areas. Okay? So something that you take for granted, meaning urban way of life, is a very recent phenomenon. Okay? So that's why it's good to know how life used to be. Okay? And that is Gemeinschaft in German, and Gesellschaft is right there. And thinking that this is just, not enough, I came up with a table. And this is a beauty. Here we go. Comparison of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And I want you to memorize this for your final exam. I'm just kidding. So I hope you could take in the difference between Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft. I'll give you 5 minutes. I'm just kidding. Just read it. At least you should read every line, okay? And what the differences are. I hope you get you have a good sense of the difference, okay? I'm turning now, and I'm turning. Next, a view on urban life is proposed by George Simmel. I think he's also a German guy. And he came up with the concept of blasé urbanite. Okay? Is blasé French? And according to Simmel, individuals experience cities as a collision of people, objects, and events. Living in urban areas is akin to one's senses working over time. Are you familiar with a punk band called Ecstasy? They had a minor hit called Senses Working Over Time. It's a beautiful song, and it's really what's happening to you, isn't it? Aren't you, compared to you, think of a farmer in the countryside, not in Korea, but more peaceful country. There, life is more sort of easy, right? It's, I don't know if this generalization is correct, but I mean, I wouldn't say like farmers in India would be having an easy life, because life is difficult there. But let's say, but you know what I'm saying, right? The living in an urban area, your senses are definitely more exposed to more stimuli than, let's say, people living in rural areas. Is that agreeable? Okay? So this is really something that has not happened to 99.9% of humans who have lived on the planet. Okay? Because we have all the, right now, look at yourself. You get on the bus, there are people, right? That you have to sort of pay attention to, even in passing. You get in the subway, you got to think about where to sit and worry about, if anybody's going to touch you or talk to you, right? And also when you get home, you watch television maybe, your cell phone. Again, I hope I said enough. Our senses, living in urban areas, are working overtime. They are overburdened. Okay? So how do we cope with this? So again, living in urban area means that your senses are working overtime. So you need a rest. And how do you rest? He says that living in urban area means that you develop what is called blasé attitude. And that is to tune out, becoming insensitive to what goes on around you. Like when you get on the bus or when you get on the subway, do you try to just sort of catch what's going on, or you try to maybe close your eyes and sort of not think about what's going on? Because there's just, if you don't do that, there's just too many things that would bother you, right? Isn't that true? So without you knowing, you probably have been doing this to cope with the fact that your senses are working overtime. Okay? And so again, I think this is a good expression. You tune out. You just turn it off. Okay? You don't want to know. You don't want to feel. You just sort of, turn yourself off, right? So there are some examples. Well, before I show you an example that I have, can you tell me an example, maybe from your own experience, how you sort of play out this blasé attitude? Yes.
Every time we read the news and we see, oh, this country has had a natural disaster, millions of people have died, oh, this country is at war, these people are getting shot by this country. Since it's happening so much and it's so intense, we can't personally feel bad for everything. So I think we become very blasé towards those kind of situations, just like normally, and we don't think about it, and then we're like, wow, am I a bad person for not caring? But I don't think so. I think it's too much if you were to...
I mean, I think your example is good, but not necessarily tied to urbanization, right?
Well,
So, I mean, it's definitely true that when we hear about, the starving children in other parts of the world, or the war kind of thing, we don't let that bother us, because if it does, it really hurts our feeling, right? So we tune that out, but it's not necessarily because of urbanization, because we're talking about how living in an urban area, how you tune out. Yes, thank you. Yes.
I'm walking on any kind of street that has a lot of people, but just even right now, I like to take class and I don't want to hear anybody talking.
Okay. Well, that's a good example where you put on your earphones, play the music loud, so that you don't want to hear anything. Maybe you don't want to see anything. If you don't want to do that, you sort of look, you don't look up, but just look down, right? Yes.
When you're in a public place, you bump into someone or something, it's kind of like it's not exposed, so you just ignore it
So you bump into someone
by accident.
by accident, and
Like if there's a crowded place, like on the street or something,
and
you just
without saying you're sorry.
yeah,
That is a way of tuning out.
it's kind of like
Mm,
I just happen to say just ignore it.
I see. Okay, well, I think some people may do that. Okay, good. Anyone else? Your very unique way of tuning out, or blasé attitude. Have you ever witnessed a fight and you never intervened? Hands up. Well, quite a few. All right, so the idea here is I want you to sort of think about how, without you recognizing it, all along, you have been sort of acting this out, right? A blasé attitude. Chances are, okay? The don't get involved attitude, right? I think I told you, right? It's okay. Anyway, there have been a number of recorded incidences in which people have been mugged or beaten in plain view of pedestrians who refuse to help the victim. This is a very often cited example that happened in the USA in 1964. It happened such a long time ago, but it's still being cited because it was so shocking. Okay, this woman was murdered in the apartment complex, and later studies found that at least 38 residents heard her cries, but what did they do? Nothing. Okay? Yes.
The problem in that case is that she was known to be transsexual and stuff, so that goes a factor into why they consider it as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of studies on this case, and so the example of 켜 있는데.
그 다음 대구 말씀해 주세요.
Okay. And yes.
Just to point out something, I don't think that's really a valid point that some people thought it shows something, but either way, she was still fine at the hospital. Even if somebody heard her from down the street, how would they know it was the girl that was in the situation? So
Oh, I see.
I don't
Okay.
think it's a valid point to consider that. And also, I think the most important point here is the fact that everybody, every one of those 38 other residents were like, oh, somebody else will do
Yeah.
it, or somebody else will do something, so somebody else will do it, and nobody did anything.
Well, that is sort of, leaving the responsibility to someone else is can be said to be a part of blasé attitude. Yes? Okay. Well, so there you go. The bystander apathy is also related to the fact that, when there are many other people, then you sort of feel less responsible to take action. Okay? Urbanites also minimize involvement by removing themselves from easy contact with others. Yes?
Just a comment on the last slide. In some states in the U.S., they've instituted the Good Samaritan law, where if you see someone who's getting mugged or beaten in plain sight, and the victim reports that there were people watching them, you can get arrested.
Wow. Okay, a student mentioned that in certain states in the USA, there is a law sort of that amounts to something like a Samaritan law, where if you are witness to a violent crime, like someone getting beaten up or getting stabbed, it is your duty to help. If you don't, you could be criminally charged. Whether that should be really enforced, I guess people have different ideas. Because if someone is wielding a knife, I don't know how many people would be because of the law, how many people would be really willing to help the victim, right? Or help the potential victim. Yes?
Just a comment as well. Have you heard about YouTube, the kind of like show called What Would You Do?
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, it's like kind of like the same, because they show like various social experiments done in Seoul. Yeah, and they like put like a girl who is crying or like some like sort of stuff, and you see people will be indifferent to it or no. And a lot of Koreans actually stop by and try to help people.
I see.
That's what's interesting.
That's really interesting to hear that, because Korean parents and wives always tell their kids and their husbands, never get involved with something that happens in the street, right? I think I told you, right? One time I held this guy from almost attacking this woman, and when I got home, I told that to my wife, and she really got mad because she felt that I could have gotten hurt, right? That is a typical reaction, I think, for a lot of Korean wives, right? So anyway, so how do we minimize contact with others? We travel by private automobile. Believe it or not, myself, for health and for environment, I try not to drive as much as I can, okay? And I ask, my colleagues, why don't you do the same? Especially female colleagues. A lot of them say, I want to drive because I don't want to be in contact with unwanted, people, like on the bus or subway. And this is a classic example, right? And a lot of people do cite this fact. They don't want to, have this unwanted contact with anybody on the bus or a subway. People live in segregated neighborhoods. filter phone calls with various applications, filter visitors through CCTV, and so on, right? And we also have a thing called personal space, don't we? We have unspoken but definite rules about how much distance to keep from others in particular situations, like where to sit, where to stand, how to walk. For example, if you got on the subway and you're the only person, and if on the next floor this guy comes in and stands right in front of you, this big, you can just imagine, right? That is a pure 100% violation of personal space rule. Again, there's nothing that says on the elevator, if there are only two people in the elevator, please stand as far as away from each other. There is no such rule, but there is unwritten rule, right? This is also how we want to minimize involvement with others, okay? This woman, was not a show. She really carries it around to maintain her personal space. These two men are rather famous, especially on the left. Colbert, just to make fun of, I guess, this personal space. This is the kind of example that I told you about in the elevator, right? And this is a personal space diagram. So intimate space, this is with your family member, lover. So if you have a intimate person, measure how far you are after the class. So less than 45 to 75 meters. So 45 centimeters to 75 centimeters. Friends, extended family, personal space, 75 centimeters to 1.2 meters. Social space, acquaintances and colleagues, 1.2 to 3.6 meters. And public space, we're talking about strangers. So you can see how on the bus, especially on the subway during rush hours, your personal space is, just terribly violated, right? Because you're, squeezed, you're touched, urbanization in Korea. So this would be like a second last part for today's lecture. By 1789, there were only 3 cities with more than 20,000 residents in Korea. And the proportion of urban population was a mere 3.3%. This is Seoul in 1890s. Have you been to Gangwon? That's right here. In 1890s. Isn't this wonderful? You see the mountain? So if you are standing in front of Gyeongbokgung, and behind Gyeongbokgung there's a blue house, and behind that you'll see this, right? 1890s. You can see all the roofs are thatched, right? They're like straws, okay? And you notice how, except for these East Gate and South Gate, we didn't really have a building that was built more than like 2-story high. They're basically 1-story high, okay? And you sort of have to ask yourself, was it because of the lack of technology or something related to philosophy? Okay? Philosophy meaning, I don't know this, and I want you to look this up. And I'd like to ask your Korean students, did our ancestors make use of wheels extensively? Yes, wheels. We did? anyway, this is Seoul in 1903. These images are really wonderful, aren't they? And the same, again, this is like 1903 Seoul. And for comparison, you know, I wanted to see how some of the cities in the most industrialized nations were like at the same time, same period. This is Seoul, Paris, 1900s. This is London, okay? And if you are sort of like, wow, this is nothing compared to New York. This is New York in 1900, okay? It's huge and wow. And this is, you know, Seoul, of course, now. Three stages of urbanization in Korea. If we are to describe urbanization in Korea in stages, when do you think was the first stage? When did we really begin to urbanize? Yes. Actually, good try. Slightly before that. And that was? Yes. Japanese colonial period. Okay? So urbanization in Korea began in earnest during the Japanese colonial rule because before 1910, Korea was what is called hermit kingdom. It was a very closed society, politically, economically, and so on, right? So there was no real major social trend or change taking place. Okay? It was a very sort of slow-moving, sort of unchanging society. So that's why a lot of things happen during the Japanese colonial rule, including urbanization. Okay? So this is when, so you can see the numbers there, right? When the Japanese sort of colonized Korea, the proportion of the population living in urban areas was only about 3 to 5%, but that proportion increased to 10 to 20% between 1910 and 1945. And urbanization at the time was closely linked to Japanese needs. Until 1935, Korea served mainly as a supply of rice, and that's why some of the cities in the south, like Mokpo, Gunsan, and Daejeon, were developed as important centers for rice supply. But after 1935, and 1935 is a key point in the Japanese colonial rule in Korea because it was now beginning to plan sort of invasion of China. So now Korea, especially North Korea, was used as centers for war supplies. Okay, so that's why like places like Pyongyang was developed. Okay. And the second stage was the end of Japanese colonial rule, 1945, liberation, and to the end of the 1950s. And why is this an important period or is it a second stage? Because after the Japanese colonial rule ended, what happened was that large number of Koreans who were living abroad returned. Okay? So, and also refugees from the north escaped to the south. Okay? So the people who went to Siberia, who went to China, who went to Japan, and those who went to Japan, most of them were forced laborers, and the number of people returning to Korea was 2.2 million. Okay, that's quite a few, right? 1.3 million from Japan, over 300,000 from Manchuria, and 100,000 from other parts of China, and so on. And also 500,000 refugees from North Korea came to South Korea. Many of these refugees from the North were landowners and Christians, okay? Because they were they were targeted for persecution by the communist North, okay? South Korean population in 1945 was 16 million, but it grew to 19 million by 1949. And that is an annual average increase of 6%, the highest in Korean history. And worsening rural economy also induced massive rural out-migration to cities, particularly to Seoul. Third stage was from early 1960s to the 1980s. And this is a period of rapid industrialization, which led to rapid urbanization. Okay? One of the major features of urban migration in the 1960s was the migration to one city, and that was Seoul. Between 1960 and 1970, more than 65% of all migrants headed to Seoul. Starting in the mid-1970s, there has been a diversification in the destination of migrants, where in addition to Seoul, other large cities like Busan began to attract migrants. Okay? So, you can see that the green dotted lines represent the population living in urban areas, and the red dotted lines represent population living in rural areas. And you can see how the proportion of the population living in urban areas has increased noticeably, right? While rural population continuously fell. Okay, this I guess is the second last sort of part, and that is characteristics and problems of urbanization in Korea. So, so we understand that Korea has underwent 3 stages of urbanization, and the most rapid was the last one. So there must be a lot of problems associated with urbanization. So before we talk about the specifics about Korean urbanization, let's talk about the problems associated with urban dwellers all over the world. Compared to rural dwellers, what can we say about the problems or characteristics of city dwellers all over the world? Now, compared to rural dwellers, city dwellers are characterized by higher what? Yes? Okay. City dwellers have higher income than rural dwellers. What else? Am I asking too many questions? Yes?
Level of education.
Okay, higher level of education. And I guess there are more positive aspects, but let's sort of focus more on the problems, and this is what we have. Higher levels of income and education, greater social mobility, smaller families, greater diversity, less stable marriages, and this is very true. Divorce rates are higher for urban dwellers than rural dwellers. And higher reported rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, and suicide. This is universally true. Okay? In every country, urban dwellers have, again, higher rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, and suicide. Anything else to add to this? Okay. Now, about Korea. So, in Korea, more than 90% of the total population in Korea live in cities with more than 20,000 residents. There are more apartments than houses. I'm sure it's not difficult to notice that, right? Wherever you go, what do you see? You know, most of the high-rises in Korea are not office buildings, but apartments, okay? So, in the 1990s and 2000s, 90% of all new housing units were apartments, okay? And I have pictures to prove it. Not that you need to see proofs. So every single building you see, I think, high-rises, are apartment complex, apartments. You know why I intentionally have this? Because we now have more wonderful looking apartment buildings, but in the old days, every apartment building looked like this. We called them buildings that looked like matchboxes. Okay? Anyway. Third characteristic of urbanization in Korea is shortage of public facilities, such as parks, libraries, recreational centers, and sports facilities. Like, when I say tennis court, I'm talking about a tennis court that is free. Anyone can walk in and play. There is not a single tennis court that I know which is available for free to the public. It's always run by a tennis association of the neighborhood. You have to pay money, okay? Swimming pool in very short supply, okay? And ice rinks, there are less than 10 in all of Korea, as if we don't have winter as a season, okay? But for every Winter Olympics, we win so many gold medals. It's amazing. And you know how that happens, right? It's called elite training. We select athletes and we train them like hell, and then they win medals. Okay? That's why if I had any say in how the government money is spent, I think some of the money that is spent on, elite athlete training should be spent to create more tennis courts, more swimming pools, and more ice rinks. Okay? Fourth, lack of affordable housing. This is a major problem which discourages many would-be couples from getting married to begin with. Why? Housing is very expensive in Korea, and I have a very good data to prove that point. So housing prices in cities, especially in Seoul, are very high, and this is sort of an understatement. Excessively high. And that is leading to what is called shelter poor, meaning you have a shelter, but that is sort of not good, okay? And there's a thing called price to income ratio. Have you heard of this? And this is what it is. PIR is the ratio between the price of a median home or average home to that of the median or average annual household income in a particular area. Okay? So PIR, again, is the ratio between the, let's say, to put it in a more layman's term, average income versus average priced house. Okay? And this is what you get. In Seoul, the median price, or let's call it average price of an apartment, is about $700,000. $700,000. Now, what do you think is the average income? Oh, I think I should have had average income first. But anyway, using this PIR, you know how long it takes a person living in Korea to buy a house without spending a single one? They do this PIR by thinking of, you earn this amount, you don't spend any money, and how long does it take to buy that house? It takes 13.4 years in Korea. All right? Oh, what? So why do I have here 13.4 and here 11.2? Oh, I was looking at 2017. Okay? So what this means is that it takes person living in Seoul, working, takes 11.2 years without spending a single cent to buy a house. So in comparison, so the workers living in Beijing, they're in deeper trouble than people living in Seoul. And the same thing goes for people living in Vancouver. But if you look at other countries, like other cities, like New York, even Tokyo, it only takes like 5.7 years, 4.8 years in those cities. But as a, although these cities are not included, you could name other major cities, and still it would be not as bad as Seoul for most cities in the world. Okay? So that's why ratio of home ownership is rather low. In Seoul, in Korea, we have the home ownership ratio of 56%. But if you look at other developed nations, it's like 65 to like almost 70%. Yes?
I was wondering, like, if it's so difficult to own a house because you have to work a lot of time for being able to afford it, like, how people buy houses, like, do they get any kind of support from banks? There are, like, private entities that speculate with houses? I don't know.
So for, ordinary citizens, young people, they cannot buy a house. Because with the current law, you have to have about half of the down payment with your own money. Meaning, if the house you want to buy is $700,000, you have to have $350,000 of your own money to get a loan on the other half. Okay? So how many ordinary Koreans do you think have that amount of money? Right? So that's why the home ownership is only for the rich. I mean, that is the popular perception, right? Because housing prices have gone up really, really high in the last 2 years in particular. Okay? So the government is trying to provide some affordable housing, but it's usually not for buying, but for rent. Okay? And I just threw this in. A percentage of population who are homeless. Okay? So Korea has one of the lowest homelessness rate. We're talking about people who like live on the street, right? So fifth is pollution, and this is actually, this is not really a universal problem. It's a problem that is more true for Seoul and other major cities. Because of this, we have a large number of power plants which use coals. I'm missing a phrase, use. This proportional number of vehicles using diesel fuel, this is also more hazardous. It produces more hazardous exhaust, right? And waste incineration. As a country, we no longer have a single waste dump. No. Is that the right term? Where you just dump waste? What do you call that? Landfill. We don't have a single landfill. We used to have some. The last of which is, you know where the Sangam World Cup Stadium is? It is built on the old landfill. Okay? And that was the last one. So what do we do with all the waste? Yes, we're really good at recycling, but we still do have waste. And what do we do with that? We burn. And have you ever seen any incinerators? Now you look around wherever you walk around, because you'll see almost wherever you go. And I have pictures. Nice apartment, right next to it, incinerator. 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 And this sort of a weird, nice looking building, incinerator. Incinerator. And they call it tower. Okay? And actually they have a restaurant there. Okay? Restaurant. Revolving. Incinerator. So you will find waste incinerator in your neighborhood. Why in your neighborhood? Let's say garbage produced in Seoul. Where can you take that to? You cannot take that to any other local governments, because why would they burn why would, let's say, Gyeonggi province or any local government in Gyeonggi wants to burn waste produced by people living in Seoul, right? That's why you'll find these incinerators in many of your neighborhoods. Okay? And they burn them usually at night when you're sleeping. Okay? Crowding is a sixth problem of urbanization in Korea. Cities are crowded in at least two ways. One is residential crowding, and that is large numbers of people living in small spaces like apartment buildings. This is very true in Korea, right? And there's a household crowding. City apartments are typically small. So they go sort of hand in hand, at least in Korea, okay, or Seoul. And if you ever wondered why, people you run into tend to be grumpy, they sort of don't smile at all, sort of feel depressed. Maybe it's because of crowding. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just imagine yourself being stuck in a crowded subway train, right? So again, crowding is not good in any sense of the imagination. So people living in Seoul, especially, are said to have one of the highest stress levels in the world due to a high population density. As you know, as a country, we have a high population density, which is 507 per square kilometers. But in Seoul, it's but more than 30 times higher, okay, than the national population density, okay? And when it comes to most densely populated city, it's Manila, okay, with over 43,000 persons per square kilometers. And I'll show you why crowding is not good. This is Myeongdong. Okay? I mean, it's not like this all the time, but I think I wanted to show you how it can, get crowded this way. On weekends, especially, with all the tourists. And subway. And subway in Korean is 지하철, right? Literally subway train. We jokingly say, especially during rush hours, we say 지옥철, hell train. That's really interesting, isn't it? 지옥철. The impact of crowding. We can't really do a study on people, but there have been many lab researchers, and we have these examples, okay? Like rats in laboratory pens, and they were allowed to breed until the number rose far beyond that found in their natural environment, and guess what happened? Okay, many females became infertile, and so on, right? Now, I don't know what you can get out of this, but right now in Korea, 1 out of every 7 women, or should I say, 1 out of every 7 couples cannot have babies. Okay? And that is significantly higher than the world average. And whether that is related to crowding, okay, or so, is something to think about. Okay? And, again, these are just laboratory studies, but overcrowding among animals has led them to become irritable, overly aggressive, nervous, and so on. Okay, so I guess people living in Seoul without us fully recognizing this, overcrowding may be impacting us in ways that we're not really aware of. Okay. 7th is crime. And so crime rates are higher in urban areas, and Korea is no exception. But overall crime rate in Korea and in Seoul, one of the lowest. Okay, so as you can see here, crime rates per 100,000 population in 2016, you can see South Korea is one of the lowest. Okay, and yes. Which? Oh, here. Oh, where is your? Oh, I mean, I just copied and pasted from the internet. So Isle of Man is where? Oh. Well, I don't know what to say. The last one is Seoul-based urbanization. And sometimes people say Seoul Republic because everything is so Seoul-focused. Okay? Seoul and the capital region is the country's economic, social, cultural, and political center. There is an excessive population in the capital region. For example, Seoul comprises only, not even 1% of the total land, but its population comprises almost 20% of the total population. The capital region, Seoul and its satellite cities, comprises 11.8% of the total land. But close to half of the population live in the region. But in comparison, population concentration of Japan's capital region is only 32%. France, 18%. Okay? So you can see what this shows you is that, you know, it wasn't like this in 1980. Things got worse over time. Okay? So I guess if you were to point fingers at anyone, it has to be policymakers and maybe capitalists. And there's also a excessive concentration of economic activities. 96% of the headquarters of large conglomerates are based in the capital region. And why do I say comparison with the United States? It's not really true, right? In the U.S., you know, most of the capital headquarters are not found in Washington or New York. They're scattered all over the country. 80% of all credit card transactions take place in the capital region, and so on. Okay? And the capital region is also the cultural and educational center of Korea, where 39.2% of all the universities are in the capital region. The most prestigious ones are also found in the region, especially in Seoul, right? Also, why compare it to the United States? If you look at the Ivy League universities and also MIT, you know, CIT, no, California Technology, Caltech, and also Stanford, Berkeley. They're not in the capital region in any way. And also concentration of amenities and others in the region. 50% of all the medical facilities and 85.4% of government offices are, and also we sometimes talk about the Gangnam Republic. All right. Since we have run out of time, I'll stop here. Okay? Thank you.